This is The Great Gatsby, Chapter 4. We start with a catalogue of the people who've been attending Gatsby's parties. Why it is that Nick wants to keep a list of these people, I do not know. But he's been writing down their names, and they're all the New York A-listers, the big names, the fancy families, the people who've built the country up to be what it is. There are also a bunch of new arrivals, and generally they have the more European names. And there's a bunch of really pretty plaything girls who are indistinguishable from each other. They're called Consuela and Judy and Julia, and they're probably related to these magnificent capitalists if you press them for that information. He is not very taken with Gatsby. He's become rather disappointed in him and describes him as somebody who is just the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. So the initial promise of living next door to Gatsby hasn't been realised, and he actually finds him rather dull, not having much to offer. But one day, quite out of the blue, Gatsby says, "I'm taking you to lunch in town," and invites him over, and we meet for the first time the car. Now, the car is an important status symbol. It's something that everyone aspires to. A snazzy car figures prominently in the American dream. But this particular car, it's a doozy. It is a rich cream colour, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirror a dozen suns. This is dazzling. This car is right out of the ordinary. And it's so impressive as part of Gatsby's invented self, but it's also, as we know, it's the instrument of death. And so it symbolises the American dream in more ways than one. It's incredibly impressive. Actually, it's going to crash and everyone's going to die. So they go up to New York. Gatsby says that he's going to have lunch with him, take him to lunch. And on the way, Gatsby tells him this totally made up backstory. He pretends that he's confiding in Nick and wanting to let him know about his early life. And he tells him this really, frankly, unbelievable story. You kind of wouldn't know where to look if you were being told it, because he claims, amongst other things, that San Francisco, which, as we know, is on the West Coast, is in the Midwest. He lays claim to being the son of a wealthy Midwestern family who are all dead. He lays claim to being educated at Oxford, which sounds pretty unlikely. He lays claim to having lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe: Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that had happened to me long ago. It's the kind of stuff that you read in a boy's adventure book. Very hard to keep a straight face, and Nick says that he struggled to restrain his incredulous laughter. However, then he moves on to the war and says that he tried very hard to die, but he wasn't able to do it. And he did, in fact, find himself in a situation where he distinguished himself. And as a result of that, he was given a decoration by every Allied government, even Montenegro. And then, bizarrely, little Montenegro, which is a tiny state in the Balkans that became the seat of a great deal of remains the seat of a great deal of political disturbance, he actually produces a medal which appears to be real from Montenegro. And still worse, he produces a photograph of himself at Oxford. He said he was educated there as part of a family tradition. He does, in fact, have a picture of himself in Trinity Quad with a couple of other blokes clutching a cricket bat. So Nick's a little bit discomforted by this. There does appear to be some truth in what he said. What we later find out is that he did go to Oxford because he didn't have enough money to come back home, and there was a scheme for the servicemen which gave them the opportunity to attend there for a while. So what he's doing is hijacking Gatsby, taking him into town. His intention is to have lunch with him and to wise him up, soften him up, so that he will get ready to speak. He's got Jordan ready to speak to him about what Gatsby wants from him. And what Gatsby wants from Nick is that Nick should invite Daisy over for afternoon tea and invite Gatsby along to the same event. But as they enter into New York, it's this triumphal arrival. They come into the city, and this magnificent description. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria. Only half, because this is a feature of New York City. They then go under the elevated railway. It's not there anymore. They twist amongst the pillars, and then he hears a familiar sound of a police motorcycle, and they pull him over. Gatsby just hands this guy a card, and the police officer says, "Oh, right you are," and off he goes. Gatsby explains that he was able to do the commissioner a favour once. And basically what we're seeing here is the fact that Gatsby has some sort of "do not touch this man" card. It's corruption. He's got some sort of an in with the police department. But then we continue the drive into the city. And he says the city seen from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds and more cheerful carriages for friends. A few lines on, as we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur in which sat 3 modish negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over the bridge, I thought, anything at all. So that is actually true, because what we've just seen, that's a scene that he wouldn't have seen back home in the Midwest. But it's also the metaphorical truth. Then it's a roaring noon and they're in a restaurant in 42nd Street. And here, Nick introduces him to his friend, so-called Mr. Wolfheim. Wolfheim is a repellent character. Almost straight away, we discover the hair growing out of his nostrils. We discover that he has a friend called Cat's Paw. That's a pun. Cat's Paw is somebody who's being manipulated by others. He recounts without a sense of awkwardness a memory. I can't forget, so long as I live, the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there at a restaurant that he'd rather be at. And then this is quite detailed description of this bloke being gunned down in front of him. And Nick remembers that 4 of the people involved were electrocuted, meaning they went to the electric chair. So what Wolfheim is doing is establishing Gatsby's criminal connections. We are seeing Gatsby's criminal connections. We are seeing that this magnificent car and all this splendiferous house has come from somewhere, and it looks as though this decidedly shady character might have something to do with it. And he does. It turns out much later in the story that the 2 of them have been in business selling bootleg liquor. And before we get to the end of the chapter, we've discovered that also Wolfheim is the person who is responsible for rigging the 1919 World Series, which was a major baseball corruption scandal. So he's a fixer in the illegal sense. And this is the sort of person that Gatsby is associated with. We also get the story after this, when the lunch is finished, Gatsby turns around and finds that, Nick turns around and finds that Gatsby is just not there. And that's because, unexpectedly, Tom Buchanan has come into the restaurant. When Tom saw us, he jumped up and took 6 steps in our direction. "Where have you been?" he demanded eagerly. "Daisy's furious because you haven't called up." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan." They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face, and then Gatsby disappears. Then we have a time shift, and we have Jordan Baker sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel, and she tells Nick the backstory of what's happened between Gatsby and Daisy in the past. And as a soldier, he became infatuated with her in Louisville, and where she was very much the belle of the ball. But he didn't have any money, and he wasn't thought of as very suitable. But he went away, and Daisy, who had this special connection that Jordan can remember noticing, they were sitting in a car together. A year or so later, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. So they had the wedding of the year. But what Jordan goes on to reveal is that the night before the wedding, when she's been given a pearl necklace worth $350,000, that it was on Daisy's, by then drunken mind, to bail out and to change her mind about actually getting married to Tom. Jordan's the one who fixed her up and got her organised and sobered up and able to wear the $350,000 pearls the following day to the wedding. Gatsby, Jordan reveals, has been planning to meet Daisy. He actually bought the mansion next door so that they would see each other. He hoped that Daisy would wander into one of their parties, one of his parties, one night, but she didn't do it. So now Jordan has been given the job of asking Nick to ask Gatsby and Daisy to tea on the same afternoon. And it has to be done secretly. Daisy is not to know that it's a plan. And at the end of this revelation, Nick kisses her.